Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. Thank you for joining us as we delve into the quiet void of cases that remain unsolved and people who are simply gone. A person is a collection of memories, relationships, and daily routines. But what happens when that presence is suddenly erased? When an individual vanishes without a trace, leaving behind only a chilling silence and a life interrupted. In this series, we will objectively examine the timelines, the sparse clues, and the haunting questions left in the wake of those who have disappeared into the unknown, exploring stories that defy simple explanation. Case 1. The Fire That Erased 5 Children. The year is 1945. The world is breathing a collective, exhausted sigh of relief. The Great, Terrible War is over, and across America, families are reuniting, rebuilding, and daring to look toward a future no longer shrouded in the shadow of global conflict. In the small, coal mining town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, the Christmas season arrives on a current of crisp mountain air, carrying with it a fragile but determined sense of optimism. Within this community lived the Sauter family, a vibrant and well-regarded household that was, in many ways, the embodiment of the American dream. The patriarch, George Sauter, had journeyed to the United States from his native Tula, Sardinia, in 1908, when he was just 13 years old. He was a man forged by hard work and principle, carrying with him the resolute spirit of an immigrant who had built a life from scratch. He eventually found his footing in the rugged landscape of West Virginia, establishing a successful trucking company that hauled dirt for construction and coal from the region's abundant mines. His success afforded his family a comfortable life, centered around a large, two-story timber frame house just north of town. George was known not only for his work ethic, but also for his strong, unyielding opinions. He never shied away from discussing his staunch opposition to the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, a sentiment that was not always popular within the proud and sometimes insular Italian immigrant community of Fayetteville. His critiques were loud, public, and passionate, earning him a reputation as a man who spoke his mind, sometimes to the point of creating friction. His wife, Jenny Cipriani Sauter, was the heart of their bustling home. Also an Italian immigrant who had come to America as a child, she was the steady, nurturing force that balanced George's fiery disposition. Together, they had 10 children. The eldest, Joe, was away serving in the military, but the other 9 still filled the home with the chaotic energy of a large, loving family. There was John, 23, Mary, and 17, George Jr., 16, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, Betty, 5, and the youngest, Sylvia, who was just 2. Their home was a landmark of sorts, a place of life, laughter, and the constant hum of activity. Christmas Eve of 1945 was meant to be a culmination of this renewed, post-war hope. Mary had just returned from her job at a local dime store, her arms laden with presents for her younger siblings. She had used her own money to buy them new toys, and their excitement was a palpable energy in the house. The younger children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were buzzing with anticipation, begging their mother to let them stay up later than their usual bedtime. They wanted to play with their new gifts, to soak in every last drop of the holiday magic. Jenny, tired from the day's preparations, relented. She reminded them to feed the cows and close the chicken coop before they went to bed, tasks they promised to complete. As the elder children, John and George Jr., finished their day's work with their father, the family settled in for the evening. Jenny took 2-year-old Sylvia upstairs and went to bed herself around 10 p.m. The 5 younger children, granted their Christmas wish, were left to their own devices in the living room. George, along with his 2 eldest sons, would also retire to bed a short time later, succumbing to the fatigue of a long day's labor. The house on the edge of Route 16 grew quiet, settling under the cold, dark blanket of the West Virginia night. But the peace of that evening was a thin veneer over a series of strange and unsettling events that had begun to needle at the family's sense of security in the months prior. These were not random, isolated occurrences, but a slow, creeping pattern of intrusions that, in retrospect, formed a dark and ominous prelude. A few months earlier, a stranger had appeared at the Sada home, inquiring about hauling work. As he walked toward the back of the house, he pointed to the fuse boxes and delivered a chillingly specific warning. "This is going to cause a fire someday," he had said to George. George thought little of it at the time. He had recently had the house rewired when they installed a new electric stove, and the power company had assured him it was perfectly safe. The incident was unsettling, but it was followed by another that was far more direct. A different man, attempting to sell the family life insurance, became aggressive when George declined the offer. His parting words were not just a threat, but a curse. "Your goddamn house is going up in smoke," he sneered, "and your children are going to be destroyed." He made sure to add a pointed jab, attributing George's impending misfortune to the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini. This was not a random act of a disgruntled salesman. It was a targeted, political threat. The shadows seemed to draw closer to the children themselves. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, the older Sauter children noticed a strange car that would often park along the main highway. Its occupant, a man they didn't recognize, would sit there for hours, intensely watching the younger siblings as they walked home from school. His presence was a silent, unnerving intrusion into their daily routine. The day of Christmas Eve itself was marked by its own share of peculiar problems. The two eldest sons, John and George Jr., were perplexed when they tried to start their father's work trucks. The vehicles, normally reliable workhorses essential to the family business, were both inexplicably dead. They tinkered with the engines, trying to diagnose the problem, but the trucks refused to turn over. It was a frustrating, but seemingly mundane, mechanical failure. That evening, as the family was winding down, the telephone rang. It was around 9 p.m. Jenny answered. On the other end of the line was a woman whose voice she did not recognize, asking for a name Jenny had never heard. Jenny politely explained that she had the wrong number. As she did, she could hear the clinking of glasses and loud, raucous laughter in the background, as if the call was being made from a rowdy bar or party. She hung up, dismissing it as a simple mistake, though the odd character of the call lingered in her mind. An hour and a half later, around 10:30 p.m., Jenny was awakened by a loud, singular sound. It was a sharp bang on the roof, followed by what sounded like a rolling noise, as if something heavy had been thrown and was now tumbling down the shingles. She sat up, listening, but the house fell silent again. Convinced she had imagined it, or that it was nothing more than a falling branch, she laid her head back down and drifted back to sleep. She would wake one more time, just after midnight, to the phone ringing again. It was the same woman, asking for the same unknown person. Jenny, now irritated, repeated that she had the wrong number and hung up. On her way back to bed, she noticed that the lights were still on in the living room and the front door was unlocked. She saw her daughter, Marion, asleep on the living room couch. She assumed the other 5 children, who had been allowed to stay up, had finally gone to their attic bedroom to sleep. She turned off the lights, locked the door, and returned to her room, the house finally surrendering to the deep silence of a night. At approximately 1 a.m. on Christmas morning, that silence was irrevocably shattered. Jenny was jolted awake again, this time not by a sound, but by a smell. Thick, acrid smoke was pouring into her bedroom. She opened the door to find that George's office, located on the ground floor, was on fire. The room was already a churning inferno, the flames greedily consuming the desk, the telephone line, and the fuse box. The primal instinct of a parent took over. She and George screamed, waking the children they could reach. John, George Jr., Mary, and 2-year-old Sylvia were roused from their sleep and scrambled out of the burning structure. But the 5 children who had gone to the attic, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were still trapped inside. Panic, raw and absolute, seized the family. George yelled up toward the attic, his voice hoarse with desperation, but there was no reply. The smoke was now a black, choking wall. The main staircase, the only interior access to the attic, was a roaring column of fire, completely impassable. Escape from within was impossible. George, his mind racing, thought of an external rescue. He ran outside, intending to use the heavy ladder that was always, without fail, propped against the side of the house. It was a fixture, a permanent part of the home's landscape. But now, in the moment he needed it most, it was gone. He and his older sons frantically searched the area around the house, their eyes straining in the flickering, hellish light of the fire, but the ladder had vanished. A new plan formed in George's frantic mind. The trucks. The very trucks that had refused to start earlier in the day. His intention was to drive one of them up to the house, climb on top of it, and smash through the attic window to reach his children. He and his sons ran to the vehicles, their hands fumbling with the keys, but it was no use. The engines remained stubbornly, eerily silent. Their mechanical failure from hours before had now become a fatal impediment. Every avenue of rescue was being systematically blocked, as if by some cruel, invisible hand. George tried to call the fire department from a neighbor's house, but the phone line was dead. He would later discover that the line leading to his own house had not been burned, but cleanly cut. Another neighbor, seeing the blaze from a distance, also tried to call, but was unable to get through to the telephone operator. It was a cascade of failures, each one more damning than the last. Desperate, George made one last, primal attempt. He smashed a lower-level window with his bare hands, slicing his arm open in the process, intending to re-enter the inferno. But by then, the entire house was engulfed. The heat was a physical force, pushing him back. The home that had been the center of their world was now a funeral pyre, and there was nothing he or anyone could do but watch it burn, the screams of the trapped children existing only in their horrified imaginations. The Fayetteville Fire Department, led by Chief F.J. Morris, was notoriously slow. The town had no siren, and firefighters were contacted by a telephone tree system person calling the next. On this night, the system failed completely. The fire was first spotted around 1 a.m. The department did not arrive on the scene until 8 a.m., 7 hours later. By then, there was nothing left to save. The proud, 2-story house had been reduced to a smoldering pile of ash and charred timber, filling a blackened hole in the ground where the basement had been. The official explanation for the delay was as baffling as it was tragic. Chief Morris claimed he couldn't drive the fire truck and had to wait for a man who could. The town's entire fire department, it seemed, was dependent on a single driver who could not be reached for hours during the town's most devastating fire. In the cold, gray light of Christmas morning, the Sauter family stood numbly before the ruins, their minds struggling to process the scale of their loss. They had lost their home, their possessions, and, they believed, 5 of their children. The official narrative quickly took shape. The fire was a tragic accident, likely caused by faulty wiring, and the 5 children upstairs had perished in the blaze. Death certificates were issued on December 30th, just 5 days after the fire. The cause of death for Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty was listed as fire or suffocation. The case, for all official purposes, was closed. But for George and Jenny Sauter, the nightmare was just beginning. And it was a nightmare not of fire, but of doubt. The first seed of that doubt was planted by the fire chief himself. When George questioned why no bones, no skeletons had been found in the ashes, Chief Morris offered a bizarre explanation. He claimed that the fire had been hot enough to completely cremate the bodies, leaving nothing behind. A local crematorium employee contested this immediately, informing the Sauters that human bones remain even after bodies are burned at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for over 2 hours. The Sauter house fire, while intense, would not have reached those temperatures for that duration. It had burned for less than an hour before collapsing. To test this, Jenny, in a quiet act of desperate research, began burning small animal bones, chicken bones, beef joints in their garden. In every instance, a recognizable skeletal structure remained. The thought that 5 children could be utterly incinerated, leaving not a single tooth or bone fragment, began to seem not just unlikely, but impossible. The Sauters pleaded with Chief Morris to conduct a more thorough search of the basement. He and his men did a cursory sift through the debris, but reported finding nothing. The family was told that the site was too dangerous and that they should leave it be. George, unable to bear the sight of the ruin that was once his home, took a bulldozer and filled the basement cavity with 5 feet of dirt, intending to create a memorial garden for his lost children. He wanted to consecrate the ground, to give their final resting place a measure of peace. But peace would not come. The strange events from before the fire, once seen as isolated incidents, now reassembled themselves in George's mind into the framework of a conspiracy. The threat from the insurance salesman, the man watching his children, the disabled trucks, the cut phone line, the missing ladder, the mysterious thump on the roof, and, most importantly, the complete and total absence of his children's remains. This collection of anomalies pushed George to hire a private investigator, C.C. Tinsley. Tinsley's investigation quickly unearthed disturbing connections and testimonies that deepened the mystery. He discovered that the insurance salesman who had threatened George was, coincidentally, a member of the coroner's jury that had officially ruled the fire an accident. This was a glaring conflict of interest, suggesting the official verdict may have been tainted from the start. Tinsley also uncovered a startling admission from a local minister. The minister claimed that Fire Chief F.J. Morris had confessed to him that the story about finding no remains was a lie. According to this account, Morris had found what he described as a heart in the ashes. He claimed to have placed it in a metal box and secretly buried it at the site. The alleged purpose of this act was to spare the Sauter family further pain by preventing them from seeing the grisly discovery. Confronted with this by George, Morris eventually led him to the spot where he claimed to have buried the box. They dug, and they found a metal box. But when George opened it, it contained not a human heart, but fresh beef liver, untouched by fire. The deception was clear. Morris later defended his actions by saying he had hoped that finding the box would satisfy the Sauters and convince them to end their search, allowing the community to move on. Instead, it did the opposite. It confirmed to George and Jenny that there was an active cover-up, that officials were not just incompetent, but were deliberately misleading them. The investigator also began to collect witness statements that painted a picture not of a fire, but of an abduction. A bus driver who passed through Fayetteville late on Christmas Eve told Tinsley he had seen several people throwing balls of fire at the Sauter house. This aligned with Jenny's memory of the loud thump on the roof, suggesting the fire may have been started by an incendiary device, like a napalm pineapple bomb. More chillingly, sightings of the children themselves began to emerge. A woman who was operating a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, about 50 miles west, claimed to have seen the children on Christmas morning. She recalled serving them breakfast and noted that they were accompanied by 2 men and 2 women, all of whom appeared to be of Italian extraction. They were driving a car with Florida license plates. She said she tried to speak kindly to the children, but one of the men gave her a hostile look, and the entire group was tense and quiet. Another woman, at a hotel in Charleston, also claimed to have seen the children about a week after the fire. "I do not remember the exact date," she told the police in a statement. The children were accompanied by 2 men and 2 women, all of Italian extraction. They were all very well dressed. "I tried to talk to the children, but the men would not allow it." Her account, independent of the first, mirrored its key details: the children, the 4 adult captors, their Italian appearance. The evidence was mounting, pointing away from a tragic accident and toward a sinister, well-orchestrated crime. The fire was not the tragedy itself, but the diversion. The motive seemed to circle back to George's vocal criticism of Mussolini and the Italian fascist regime. Was this an act of retaliation by the local mafia, a powerful and shadowy organization with deep roots in some immigrant communities? Had they kidnapped the children to silence George, or to punish him for his dissent? In 1952, 7 years after the fire, the Sodders, refusing to let the memory of their children fade, took a drastic and public step. They erected a large billboard along Route 16, overlooking the site of their former home. It featured the portraits of the 5 missing children: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. Below their smiling, hopeful faces was a summary of the events of that night and a standing offer of a $5,000 reward for information leading to their recovery, a sum that would later be doubled to $10,000. The billboard became a haunting local landmark, a permanent testament to a family's unwavering hope and a community's enduring mystery. Years turned into a decade, then 2. The billboard weathered, its colors fading under the West Virginia sun, but the Sodders' resolve did not. They followed up on every lead, no matter how tenuous. A tip from St. Louis led them to a woman who claimed their daughter Martha was being held in a convent. A letter from Texas suggested a man had overheard a drunken confession to the crime. Each lead sent them on a journey of renewed hope, and each one ended in a painful dead end. In 1963, driven by a persistent need for a definitive answer from the site itself, George once again brought in excavation equipment. He and his sons carefully sifted through the earth he had used to fill the basement years before. It was during this search that they made a discovery. They unearthed a few small, hard objects that appeared to be bone fragments. Hope surged, mingled with dread. They sent the fragments to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., for professional analysis. The report that came back was perhaps the most confounding piece of evidence in the entire case. The Smithsonian confirmed the fragments were human vertebrae. However, their analysis concluded that the bones belonged to a single individual, likely a male between the ages of 16 and 22. None of the missing children fit this age profile. Maurice, the eldest, was 14. More perplexingly, the expert noted that the bones showed no signs of ever having been exposed to fire. They could not have been in the house during the blaze. And finally, the report stated that it was highly unlikely that these few small vertebrae would be the only human remains left at a site where 5 bodies had supposedly been consumed by fire. The discovery explained nothing. It only added another layer of impossibility to an already incomprehensible story. Where had these bones come from? Had they been planted there years later, perhaps to throw the family off the scent, or to give them a false sense of closure? The years continued to pass. George Sodder, a man once defined by his strength and resolve, grew weary. The endless search had taken its toll on his health and his spirit. He passed away in 1969, Never having found an answer, his final days clouded by the unanswerable question of his children's fate. He went to his grave believing they were still alive somewhere. Jenny, now a widow, continued the vigil alone. She wore black every day for the rest of her life, a perpetual state of mourning for the children she refused to believe were dead. She tended to the memorial garden at the site of the home, a quiet, floral tribute to the vibrant lives that had vanished from her own. Then, in 1968, a year before George's death, came the most tantalizing and heartbreaking clue of all. A letter arrived at the Sada home, postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. There was no return address. Inside was a small photograph of a young man in his late 20s. He had dark, curly hair, dark eyes, and a strong jaw. The resemblance to their son Louis, who would have been in his late 20s at the time, was uncanny. It was a face they had only been able to imagine, now staring back at them from a piece of photographic paper. On the back of the photo was a cryptic, handwritten message. It read, "Louis Sauter, I love Brother Frankie. Ill boys." A 90132 or 35. The message was a puzzle. Frankie likely referred to one of the older Sauter brothers. But what did Ill boys mean? And what was the significance of the string of letters and numbers? Was it a code? A military serial number? A license plate? The Sauters hired another private investigator and sent him to Kentucky to trace the origins of the letter. But the investigator took their money and was never heard from again. Another dead end, another betrayal. The family had the photo and the note analyzed, but it led nowhere. They added a picture of the updated, older Louis to their billboard. A new face among the 5 hopeful children, a ghostly image of what might have been. Jenny Sauter passed away in 1989, 20 years after her husband. She died in her black mourning dress, her vigil finally over. After her death, the remaining Sauter children, now grown with families of their own, made the difficult decision to take the billboard down. It had stood for nearly 40 years, a silent sentinel of grief. The physical symbol of their search was gone, but the mystery remained, passed down to a new generation of grandchildren and great-grandchildren who continue to discuss the case and search for answers online. The story of the Sauter children's disappearance is a story without an ending. It exists in the space between 2 competing narratives. The first is the official one, a tragic but explainable house fire, exacerbated by an incompetent and slow emergency response that left no trace of its 5 smallest victims. It is a story of terrible luck and flawed forensics. The second is the one the family believed, a meticulously planned kidnapping disguised by arson. A crime motivated by ethnic prejudice or organized crime and covered up by a small town's authorities, either through fear or complicity. It is a story of malice, conspiracy, and a lifelong, fruitless search for stolen children. What remains today is only the void, the empty space on the side of Route 16 where a home once stood, the empty chairs at a family table that were never filled again, the silence from 5 children who went to sleep on Christmas Eve and stepped out of existence. It is a testament to the chilling reality that sometimes a person or 5 can simply vanish, leaving behind not answers or closure, but only a question mark that hangs in the air, as heavy and as permanent as a tombstone. Case 2. The Silent Lighthouse of Eileen Moore. In the vast, churning expanse of the North Atlantic, some 20 miles west of the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, lies a small, solitary cluster of rocks known as the Flannan Isles. For centuries, these islands were places of myth and caution, uninhabited by man but populated by legends. The largest among them, Eileen Moore the Big Isle, held a particular reverence. It was named for Saint Flannan, a 7th-century Irish abbot who had built a stone chapel there, a place for solitary prayer in the face of God and the unforgiving sea. Shepherds from the mainland would bring their flocks to graze on its surprisingly lush grass, but they adhered to a strict, unspoken code of conduct. They would never stay the night. They believed the island was a place of potent, ancient power, a domain of spirits they called the Little People, and to linger after dusk was to court a fate from which there was no return. By the end of the 19th century, the age of steam and steel had begun to chart these dangerous waters with new frequency. The Flannan Isles stood as a significant hazard on the shipping lane between Scotland and the Americas. In 1895, the Northern Lighthouse Board, the grand authority on maritime safety in Scotland, decreed that a light was needed. A monument to progress and safety would be erected on this ancient, haunted rock. The construction was a monumental feat of engineering and endurance. A landing stage was blasted into the sheer cliffs on the east side of the island, and a second, higher one on the west for use during the violent winter storms. A small railway was built to haul materials up the 150-foot incline to the island summit. And there, on the highest point of Eilean Moor, they built the lighthouse. It was a proud, 75-foot tower of white-brushed stone, a bastion of Victorian certainty designed by the famed lighthouse engineer David Allen Stevenson. When its lamp was first lit on December 7, 1899, its powerful beam cut through the darkness for 24 nautical miles, a promise of safe passage in a treacherous world. The lighthouse required a team of 4 keepers to operate. 3 would be on duty at the station for a 6-week shift, while the 4th remained on shore, resting before his next rotation. It was a life of profound isolation, governed by the rhythmic turning of the lamp, the meticulous keeping of the daily log, and the constant, overwhelming presence of the sea and sky. It demanded men of a specific temperament, resilient, disciplined, and comfortable with silence. In December of 1900, 1 year after its commission, the lighthouse on Eilean Moor was manned by just such a crew. The principal keeper was James Duckett, a 43-year-old veteran of the service with over 2 decades of experience. He was a quiet, steady family man, known for his professionalism and calm demeanor. Serving under him was Thomas Marshall, the second assistant. At 28, he was younger but also a seasoned keeper. The third man was Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper, a replacement for the regular team member who was on sick leave. MacArthur was a different sort of man. At 40, he was a braw, burly chap, a tough, experienced seaman from the mainland, known for having a bit of a temper. He was not a career lighthouse man, but a hired hand, accustomed to the rough and tumble life of a sailor. Despite their different personalities, they were all considered reliable men, entrusted with the vital task of keeping the light burning. The story of their disappearance begins not with a bang, but with an absence. On the night of December 15, 1900, the steamer Archdor, on its passage from Philadelphia to Leith, navigated the waters near the Flannan Isles. Her captain, looking toward the familiar position of the lighthouse, noted in his own log that the lamp was not lit. In the unforgiving darkness of the North Atlantic, a dark lighthouse is a deeply unsettling sight, a broken promise. Upon docking in Scotland, the captain duly reported his observation to the Northern Lighthouse Board. Ordinarily, such a report would have triggered an immediate investigation. But this was December in the Outer Hebrides. A furious storm system had moved in, battering the coast with gale-force winds and mountainous seas. The waters around Eilean Moor became a cauldron of white foam and black water, making any approach by boat impossible. For days, the relief vessel, the tender Hesperus, sat docked at Brestleet Harbor on the Isle of Lewis, waiting for a break in the weather. The man waiting most anxiously was the 4th member of the Eilean Moor crew, the relief keeper Joseph Moore. It was his turn to return to the island, and it was his colleagues who were out there, silent, in the heart of the storm. Finally, on Boxing Day, December 26th, the weather calmed just enough for the Hesperus to make the perilous journey. The mood aboard the vessel was tense. Captain Jim Harvey had a deep sense of foreboding. As they approached Eileen Moore, the island rose from the gray sea like a fortress, silent and imposing. The sky was clear, the sea relatively calm, but the island itself seemed unnaturally still. The first sign that something was profoundly wrong was the bare flagstaff. A flag should have been flying to welcome the relief ship. There was none. As they drew closer to the eastern landing, they saw no keepers waiting to catch the ropes, no sign of life on the cliff path. The landing itself showed signs of recent storm damage, but nothing that would explain the complete absence of the men. Captain Harvey sounded the ship's horn, a loud, mournful blast that echoed off the cliffs and was swallowed by the immense silence. He ordered a flare to be fired into the sky. There was no response. The lighthouse stood impassive, its white tower stark against the gray sky. A profound sense of dread settled over the crew. Joseph Moore, his face etched with worry, was the first to go ashore. He was rowed to the landing stage and began the long, lonely climb up the winding path to the lighthouse compound. Every step amplified the silence. There was no sound of machinery, no voices, just the cry of gulls and the distant wash of the sea. He reached the entrance gate to the compound and found it closed. He unlatched it and walked into the small courtyard. The main door to the lighthouse itself was also closed, but, to his surprise, it was unlocked. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. The interior was cold and still. It felt not just empty, but abandoned. In the small entrance hall, he saw 2 sets of oilskin coats and sea boots were missing from their hooks. One set, belonging to Donald MacArthur, remained. He moved into the keeper's living quarters. The scene that greeted him was one of domestic routine abruptly and inexplicably frozen in time. The hearth was cold, the ashes in the great long dead. The beds in the sleeping quarters were made, undisturbed. In the kitchen, a meal of salted mutton and potatoes sat on the table, untouched, as if the men had been called away just as they were about to eat. A single chair was overturned, lying on its side, a small, jarring note of chaos in the otherwise orderly room. The clock on the wall had stopped. Calling out their names, Duckett, Marshall. MacArthur's voice was absorbed by the thick stone walls. There was no answer. He searched every room, every corner of the tower, climbing the spiral staircase up to the lamp room. Everything was in perfect order. The lamp was clean and refilled with oil, ready to be lit. The lenses were polished. The machinery was immaculate. The men had clearly performed their duties with their usual diligence before they vanished. But of the men themselves, there was no sign. Moore returned to the landing, his face pale, and reported his findings to Captain Harvey. A search party was immediately dispatched. They scoured every inch of the small, rocky island. They checked the chapel of St. Flannan. They peered over the treacherous cliff edges. They found nothing. James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur had vanished from the face of the earth. Captain Harvey sent a chilling telegram back to the mainland. It read, "A dreadful accident has happened at the Flannans. The 3 keepers, Duckett, Marshall, and the occasional have disappeared from the island. The clocks were stopped, and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows, they must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that." But as the initial search continued, the clues that emerged did not point to a simple, straightforward accident. They pointed to something far stranger. The most significant piece of evidence, was the lighthouse logbook. The entries were written in the hand of Thomas Marshall. The last routine entry was for the 9th of December. The subsequent entries, however, were written on a slate for later transcription into the main log, a practice used during exceptionally busy or stressful periods. These entries described something terrifying. On December 12th, Marshall wrote of a storm with winds so severe, the likes of which I have never seen before in 20 years. This was odd, as no such storm was reported in the surrounding area on that date. The weather was rough, but not hurricane force. Even more strangely, he wrote of the character of the men. He described James Duckett, the stoic veteran, as being very quiet, and Donald MacArthur, the tough, seasoned sailor, as crying. This was almost unbelievable. What could possibly reduce a man like MacArthur to tears? Marshall concluded the entry, "I have been in a storm before, but never one like this. We are all very low." The entry for December 13th was even more harrowing. "Storm still raging," Marshall wrote. "Wind and sea are furious. We cannot go outside. The three of us are praying." Again, this was highly out of character. These were not men given to panic or overt displays of piety. Something they were experiencing was pushing them to the very edge of their endurance. Then, a final, cryptic entry, dated December 15th. "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." The tone is one of relief, of peace after a great trial. And yet, this was the last thing ever heard from them. It was on the night of the 15th that the steamer Archdor had reported the light was out. If the storm was over and the sea was calm, why would the light not be lit? And why, if the danger had passed, would the men then disappear? The official investigation was led by Robert Muirhead, the superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board. He arrived on the island a few days after the discovery and conducted his own thorough inspection. Muirhead's attention was drawn to the western landing, the one used during heavy seas. He found clear evidence of catastrophic storm damage. A supply box, which had been securely stored in a crevice 110 feet above sea level, had been dislodged and its contents strewn about. Iron railings along the cliff path were bent and twisted out of shape. A large section of rock, weighing more than a ton, had been displaced. From this evidence, Muirhead constructed his official theory. He concluded that on the afternoon of December 15th, after the storm had passed, Duckett and Marshall must have gone down to the western landing to secure the equipment and check for damage. He surmised that they were then hit by a sudden, massive rogue wave, a single, colossal wall of water that had surged up the cliff face and swept them into the sea. He theorized that MacArthur, the occasional keeper, had seen this from the lighthouse and, against all regulation and reason, had run down to help them, only to be swept away by the same or a subsequent wave. Muirhead's report offered a rational, natural explanation for an otherwise baffling event. It spoke of the awesome, unpredictable power of the ocean. It was tidy, logical, and it closed the case. The Northern Lighthouse Board officially accepted his conclusion. The three men were declared lost at sea, victims of a freak act of nature. But for those who knew the men, and for those who studied the case in the years that followed, Muirhead's explanation, while plausible, was riddled with inconsistencies. It left too many crucial questions unanswered. First, why would all three keepers have gone down to the landing together? The rules of the Lighthouse Board were explicit and drilled into every keeper. One man must always remain on duty in the tower. For three veteran keepers, two of them highly experienced, to abandon their post simultaneously was a dereliction of duty so fundamental as to be unthinkable. Second, there was the matter of the oilskins. Two sets were missing, but Donald MacArthur's remained in the lighthouse. The storm had passed, But the air on a December afternoon in the North Atlantic would have been brutally cold, with constant sea spray. Why would MacArthur, an experienced seaman, run out into that environment without his protective gear? It suggested he left in an extreme hurry, with no time to think. Third, the scene inside the lighthouse itself. The untouched meal, the overturned chair. These details speak of a sudden interruption inside the living quarters, not an accident that occurred far down on the western landing. They suggest a moment of panic or a hasty departure from the tower itself. How does this fit with the rogue wave theory? Did the waves somehow reach the lighthouse itself, 150 feet up? There was no water damage inside to suggest this. And finally, the logbook entries. Were they a genuine record of a localized, supernatural storm that no one else saw? Or were they a record of a psychological breakdown, a storm of the mind brought on by the crushing isolation? Some later researchers have even suggested the most troubling log entries were a later invention, a piece of folklore created by a journalist to sensationalize the story. But Captain Harvey and Joseph Moore both reported seeing the slate with the strange notes upon their arrival. With the official explanation leaving so much room for doubt, a host of other theories, ranging from the plausible to the paranormal, have grown up around the Eileen Moore mystery. One theory posits that the men were not all lost to the sea at the same time. It speculates that a fight broke out between them. Perhaps Donald MacArthur, with his known temper, clashed with one of the other men. The overturned chair could be evidence of a violent struggle. In this scenario, one man might have killed the other two and then, consumed by guilt, thrown himself into the ocean. This could account for the strange log entries about MacArthur crying. Perhaps he was emotionally volatile and a conflict had been brewing for days. But it doesn't explain what happened to the bodies, nor why 2 sets of oilskins were taken. Another, more elaborate theory is that the men were taken from the island. Whispers of foreign spies and government secrets have been attached to the case. Could a foreign vessel have landed and abducted the keepers for some unknown reason? It seems wildly improbable, but in the absence of bodies, no theory can be entirely dismissed. And then there are the supernatural explanations, the ones that connect back to the ancient lore of the island. Some believe the men ran afoul of the island's mythical inhabitants, the little people. Others have suggested a sea serpent or some other ocean creature rose from the depths and took them. The strange, localized storm described in the log is seen by some as evidence of an otherworldly event. Had the men, in their isolation, witnessed something that mortal minds were not meant to see? Did they, in their final moments, disturb the ancient spirit of St. Flannan's lonely rock? The mystery of Eileen Moore is not in the what, but in the how and the why. We know that 3 men, James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, ceased to exist on or around December 15, 1900. The official report provides a plausible, if imperfect, explanation. A rogue wave is a known and deadly phenomenon. It is entirely possible that it is the simple, tragic truth of the matter. But the story endures because the rational explanation fails to account for the human element. It fails to explain the crying man, the men praying, the coat left behind, the abandoned meal. These are the details that snag the imagination. They transform a maritime accident into a ghost story, a piece of folklore whispered by sailors and studied by investigators for over a century. The lighthouse on Eileen Moore was automated in 1971, and the island is once again uninhabited by man. The lamp still flashes, but it does so in service to a machine, its beam cutting through the same darkness over the same cold, empty sea. The island remains a place of profound solitude, forever defined by the silence left behind by its first 3 keepers. They were brought there to be guardians of the light, to provide a fixed point of certainty in a world of chaos. Instead, Their disappearance created a permanent and unyielding void, a story where the only thing we know for certain is that three men walked into the heart of a mystery and never walked out. Case 3. The Paranoia of Lars Mittink. The summer of 2014 was a season of celebration for much of the world. In Brazil, the FIFA World Cup was in full swing, a global festival of sport and national pride. For a group of young men from northern Germany, it was the perfect excuse for a holiday. They chose as their destination Golden Sands, a bustling resort town on the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria. It was a place known for its wide beaches, inexpensive beer, and vibrant nightlife, an ideal setting for a week of sun-soaked relaxation and carefree revelry. Among this group was Lars Mittink. At 28 years old, Lars was by all accounts a typical, well-adjusted young man. He lived in Marne, Germany, with his parents and worked at a local power plant. He was described by friends and family as kind, easygoing, and reserved. He had a long-term girlfriend and was a passionate fan of the Werder Bremen football club. He was not a heavy drinker, did not use drugs, and had no history of mental illness or erratic behavior. He was, in short, the picture of stability. The trip to Bulgaria was meant to be nothing more than a simple, enjoyable break with his friends. The vacation unfolded as planned. The group spent their days on the beach and their nights in the bars and clubs that lined the coast. They drank, they laughed, they watched the football matches. For a week, everything was normal. But on the final night of their trip, the trajectory of Lars's life took a sudden and violent turn. The group was in a local pub, and Lars got into a minor disagreement with another group of German tourists over their rival football teams. It was a typical, alcohol-fueled spat that, under normal circumstances, would have been forgotten by morning. Lars's friends moved on to a fast food restaurant, but Lars, for some reason, stayed behind. Later that night, outside the restaurant, he was confronted by the same group from the bar. This time, the confrontation turned physical. Lars was punched in the head and suffered a ruptured eardrum. The injury was painful, but not life-threatening. However, it came with a significant complication. A doctor who examined Lars the next morning advised him that due to the pressure changes involved in air travel, flying with a ruptured eardrum could cause further damage. He was told he could not fly home with his friends as scheduled. The doctor prescribed a course of antibiotics, cefuroxime 500, and recommended he stay in Bulgaria for a few more days to allow the injury to heal. This was the first point of divergence, the moment Lars was separated from the familiar comfort of his social circle. His friends, unable to change their flights, offered to stay with him, but Lars insisted they go. He assured them he would be fine. He was a grown man. He could manage on his own for a few days. He planned to take a bus back to Germany once he was cleared to travel. His friends departed, leaving Lars alone in a foreign country, with a painful injury and a course of medication he had not yet started. It was in this solitude that Lars Mittink began to change. He checked into the Hotel Color in Varna, a city near the Golden Sands resort. The hotel was cheap and situated in a relatively rough part of town, a stark contrast to the tourist-friendly environment he had just left. It was here, alone in his hotel room, that his behavior became deeply strange. He made a frantic, whispered phone call to his mother, Sandra Mittink, back in Germany. He told her that he did not feel safe. He said that 4 men were following him and that he believed they wanted to rob or kill him. He asked her to cancel his credit cards. He mentioned the antibiotics the doctor had prescribed, cefuroxime 500, but in his panic state, he simply referred to them as 500. He told his mother, "I don't think it's a good idea. This 500. They will kill me for it." His mother was deeply alarmed. This was not the son she knew. His fear was palpable, but his words made no sense. Why would an ordinary antibiotic be a motive for murder? She tried to calm him, to reason with him, but he was convinced his life was in danger. During the call, he claimed the men were outside his hotel room and that he had hidden on top of or under the bed to escape them. He then abruptly hung up, texting her a short time later with the details of the antibiotic. The next morning, July 8, 2014, was the day Lars was scheduled to fly home. Despite his fear of flying with the injury, he seemed to have decided that a plane was his only way out. He took a taxi to Varna Airport. On the way, he called his mother again. He sounded more composed, telling her he had made it to the airport terminal. But his paranoia had not subsided. He told her that he was not being allowed to leave Bulgaria and that they would not let him fly. At the airport, he sought out the airport's medical center, likely to get a final clearance to fly. The doctor on duty, Dr. Kostakostov, examined him. Dr. Kostov later described Lars as being nervous and erratic. He told the doctor that he couldn't trust the medication he had been given. His pupils were dilated, and his behavior was increasingly agitated. It was during this examination that the situation escalated dramatically. A man, described by Dr. Kostov as a construction worker due to his uniform, entered the medical office. It is unclear why he was there. Perhaps he was simply another patient or was there for a routine reason. But for Lars, in his heightened state of terror, this man's presence was the final trigger. According to Dr. Kostov, upon seeing the construction worker, Lars jumped to his feet. He began to tremble and muttered, "I don't want to die here. I have to get out of here." He then bolted from the medical office, leaving all of his belongings behind: his wallet, his passport, his mobile phone, and his backpack. He had nothing with him but the clothes on his back. What happened next was captured in stark, silent detail by the airport's security cameras. The footage is one of the most haunting and widely analyzed pieces of evidence in the history of mysterious disappearances. It shows Lars running at a full sprint through the airport terminal. He is not jogging, he is running for his life. He dashes past startled travelers, his movements desperate and panicked. He exits the terminal building and continues running across the parking lot. The camera's wide-angle lens captures his next, inexplicable move. Instead of running toward the road, toward civilization, or toward anyone who could help him, he veers toward a large, formidable fence that borders the airport grounds. The fence, topped with barbed wire, is at least 8 feet high. Without breaking stride, Lars, a man of average build, effortlessly scales the fence. He lands on the other side and disappears into a dense field of sunflowers, which in turn borders a vast, wild forest. This was the last time Lars Mittank was ever seen. He ran into that field and vanished, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The aftermath was a scene of confusion and disbelief. The airport staff, Dr. Kostov, and eventually the police were left with his abandoned possessions and a chilling video of his final moments. An immediate search was launched. Police with tracker dogs combed the sunflower field and the adjacent forest. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras scanned the area from above. But they found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no discarded clothing. No Lars. Back in Germany, his family was plunged into a living nightmare. They flew to Bulgaria and plastered the Varna area with missing person posters. They hired a private investigator. They established a Facebook page, Findet Lars Mittank, Find Lars Mittank, which quickly garnered tens of thousands of followers from around the world. The CCTV footage went viral, turning Lars's private terror into a global mystery. The internet became a hotbed of theories, with amateur sleuths analyzing every frame of the video, every word of his last phone calls. The core of the mystery lies in the why. What could have transformed a stable, happy young man into a paranoid fugitive in the space of 48 hours? The theories can be broadly grouped into three categories: criminal, medical, and psychological. The criminal theory posits that Lars's fear was real. Was he, in fact, being targeted by the men he fought with at the bar? Perhaps the fight was not just a simple disagreement, but was connected to something more sinister, like organized crime or drug trafficking. In this scenario, Lars might have witnessed something he shouldn't have, and the men were not trying to rob him, but to silence him. His frantic escape from the airport would then be a rational, if desperate, act of self-preservation. He ran into the forest to hide, but perhaps he was found by his pursuers or succumbed to the elements while in hiding. This theory, however, struggles to explain why he would leave his passport and money behind, the very things he would need to escape. The medical theory focuses on the head injury and the medication. A severe concussion can sometimes induce paranoia and psychosis. Could the blow to his head have caused a brain injury that dramatically altered his perception of reality? This is a plausible explanation for his sudden change in personality. Another branch of this theory centers on the antibiotic cefuroxime. While rare, some antibiotics have been linked to neuropsychiatric side effects, including agitation, confusion, and psychosis. Could Lars have had an extreme and unusual reaction to the single dose he may have taken? Or was his fear of the 500 a manifestation of a delusion that the medication itself was poison? The psychological theory suggests a sudden, acute psychotic break, unrelated to any external threat or medical cause. The stress of being injured, alone, and in a foreign country could have triggered a latent mental health condition that neither he nor his family knew he had. In this state of psychosis, the four men he believed were following him may have been a complete fabrication of his own mind. The construction worker at the airport was not a threat, but a random person his paranoid mind latched onto as the embodiment of his fear. His flight was not from a real danger, but from the terrifying phantoms of his own psyche. The mystery is deepened by the location of his disappearance. The area around Varna Airport is a mixture of agricultural land and dense, unmanaged woodland. It is a vast and challenging terrain to search. It is entirely possible that Lars, in his panic state, ran deep into the forest, became disoriented, and ultimately succumbed to injury, dehydration, or exposure. His body may lie hidden in the dense undergrowth, never to be found. Over the years, there have been numerous alleged sightings of Lars across Europe, and even as far away as South America. Truck drivers have reported picking up a hitchhiker matching his description. Tourists have snapped photos of homeless men who bear a passing resemblance to him. Each potential lead brings a surge of hope for his family, followed by the familiar pain of disappointment when it turns out to be a case of mistaken identity. The case of Lars Mittank is uniquely haunting because of its documentation. We have his voice on the phone calls to his mother, a record of his escalating terror. And we have the video. The silent, grainy footage of him running is profoundly disturbing. It is a visual record of a mind in flight from something real or imagined. We see him in motion, full of desperate energy, and then in the next frame, he is simply gone. His story serves as a terrifying reminder of the fragility of the human mind. It shows how quickly the bedrock of reality can fracture, how a person can, in a matter of hours, become a stranger to themselves and to those who love them most. Did he run from a tangible threat, or from the shadows within his own consciousness? Did he escape to a new life, or did he run to his death in the Bulgarian wilderness? The sunflower field into which he vanished has become a symbol of this ambiguity. Sunflowers are heliotropic. They turn to follow the sun, a symbol of light and reason. But Lars Mittank ran into their midst and found only darkness. His family, particularly his mother, Sandra, continues their search with unwavering dedication, maintaining the social media presence, and following every lead. They are left suspended in a state of unknowing, clinging to the hope that one day, a man will walk out of the forest with an explanation for why he ran into it. Until then, Lars exists in that final, chilling frame of video. A young man in a dead sprint, fleeing an unseen terror, running forever toward a vanishing point we cannot see. Case 4. The Ghost Flight of MH370. In the modern world, we are surrounded by a web of constant connection. We are tracked by satellites, monitored by radar, and tethered to a global network by devices we carry in our pockets. The idea that something or someone can simply vanish has become an archaic notion, a relic of a less documented age. We have mapped the deepest oceans and stared into the furthest reaches of space. We believe, on some fundamental level, that nothing can truly be lost. On March 8, 2014, this belief was shattered. It was shattered by the disappearance of a machine that was the very embodiment of modern technology and connectivity, a Boeing 777, one of the safest and most sophisticated commercial airliners ever built. The story begins in the humid, pre-dawn hours at Kuala Lumpur International Airport in Malaysia. The atmosphere was one of routine and practiced efficiency. The aircraft, a Boeing 777-200ER registered as 9M MRO, was being prepared for its regular red-eye flight to Beijing, China. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. The plane itself was a titan of the skies, with an exemplary safety record. It was a vessel of trust, a place where hundreds of strangers would place their lives in the hands of a flight crew and the precision of its engineering. On this night, that trust was vested in two men. The captain was 53-year-old Zahari Ahmad Shah, a veteran pilot with over 18,000 hours of flying experience. He was a respected senior pilot, a training instructor, and a man so passionate about flying that he had built an elaborate flight simulator in his own home. He was known as a kind, gentle family man. His co-pilot was 27-year-old Farik Abdul Hamid. He was a young pilot on the cusp of a major career milestone. This was his final training flight before he would be fully certified as a 777 pilot. For him, this flight was the culmination of a dream. The passengers were a cross-section of humanity, a small global village sealed within an aluminum tube. There were 227 of them. The majority, 153, were Chinese nationals, many of them artists returning from an exhibition in Kuala Lumpur. There were also Malaysians, Indonesians, Australians, French, and Americans. There were vacationers, business travelers, families with young children, and individuals embarking on new chapters of their lives. Aboard the flight were 239 souls, in total 227 passengers, and 12 crew members, each with a past, a present, and a future they believed was waiting for them in Beijing. At 12:42 a.m. local time, MH370 pushed back from the gate. Its massive engines spooled up, and it taxied onto the runway. The pre-flight checks were normal. The weather was clear. There was nothing to suggest this flight would be anything other than perfectly ordinary. At 1:21 a.m., the aircraft was over the South China Sea, climbing to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Air traffic control in Kuala Lumpur tracked its steady progress. The final verbal communication from the cockpit came at this moment. The Malaysian controller radioed the standard instruction to contact their counterparts in Ho Chi Minh City as the plane was entering Vietnamese airspace. The reply from the cockpit was calm, clear, and utterly routine. It was spoken by the co-pilot, Farik Hamid. "Good night, Malaysian 370. Those 5 words were the last ever heard from the flight. They mark the precise moment that MH370 flew from the known world into the realm of profound and unsettling mystery. In the Air Traffic Control Center in Ho Chi Minh City, controllers watched their screens, waiting for MH370 to check in. The designated handover point came and went. Silence. They tried to contact the flight via radio. There was no response. The minutes ticked by, and the silence began to curdle into concern. They contacted their colleagues back in Kuala Lumpur. Had MH370 turned back? Had they heard anything? The controllers in Kuala Lumpur were equally baffled. They looked at their own radar screens, and what they saw was impossible. At 1:21 a.m., just moments after that final, placid goodnight, the icon representing MH370 had simply winked out of existence. Its transponder, the device that communicates the plane's identity, altitude, and speed to civilian radar, had stopped transmitting. The plane had become a ghost. An emergency response was initiated, but it was one plagued by confusion and miscommunication between the aviation authorities of several nations. The initial search and rescue effort was concentrated in the South China Sea, the logical area where the plane was last seen. The world awoke on the morning of March 8th to the stunning news that a modern jetliner had vanished. The initial theories were what one would expect: a sudden, catastrophic mechanical failure, a bomb, a mid-air explosion. Something that would destroy the plane so quickly that the pilots had no time to even send a distress signal. But as the days turned into a week, military radar data, which is separate from civilian systems, began to paint a picture that was not just tragic, but deeply and fundamentally bizarre. Malaysian military radar had tracked an unidentified aircraft on the night of the disappearance. This ghost aircraft, which they later determined could only have been MH370, had not crashed into the South China Sea. Instead, shortly after its transponder went dark, it had made a sharp, deliberate turn to the west, flying back across the Malay Peninsula. It then made another calculated turn, flying northwest up the Strait of Malacca, before finally turning south and flying out of range of military radar. This was not the signature of a mechanical failure. These were the actions of a skilled pilot. The turns were precise, navigated along established waypoints. Someone was flying the plane. Someone had intentionally severed its communications and flown it into the dark, far from its intended flight path. The disappearance was no longer a tragic accident. It was a deliberate act. The revelation shifted the investigation entirely. Who was in control of that cockpit? Suspicion, inevitably and painfully, fell upon the pilots. Captain Zahari, the experienced veteran, became the primary focus. Investigators seized his home flight simulator and found that, in the weeks prior to the flight, he had plotted a course on it that was eerily similar to the one the ghost flight was believed to have taken: a long, lonely journey south, deep into the vast emptiness of the southern Indian Ocean, ending only when the fuel ran out. Was this a rehearsal? Or was it merely one of thousands of flight paths a passionate aviation enthusiast might explore? His family and friends vehemently defended him, describing the theory of pilot suicide as a character assassination against a good man. While the world was grappling with the who and why, a small team of engineers at the British satellite company in Marsat were grappling with a different kind of puzzle. They had discovered that even after the plane's primary communication systems were turned off, a small, automated part of the aircraft's satellite data unit had continued to function. For 7 hours after it vanished from radar, this unit had continued to send out periodic, automated handshakes, brief electronic pings to an Inmarsat satellite orbiting high above the Indian Ocean. These pings contained no data about the plane's location, speed, or altitude. They were simply signals that confirmed the system was still powered on. But by analyzing the faint variations in the signal's frequency, a phenomenon known as the Doppler effect, and the time it took for the signals to travel, the Inmarsat engineers were able to perform a feat of digital forensics that was nothing short of brilliant. They calculated the plane's distance from the satellite at the time of each ping. This data allowed them to plot two enormous arcs on the world map, representing the possible locations of the plane at the time of its final ping at 8:19 a.m. Malaysian time. One arc stretched north, across the vast landmass of Central Asia, a corridor riddled with military radar systems that would have surely detected a rogue airliner. The other arc stretched south, across one of the most remote and desolate patches of ocean on the planet, the southern Indian Ocean. Based on the plane's estimated fuel load, the southern arc became the only viable possibility. MH370 had not crashed in the South China Sea. It had flown for 7 hours as a ghost ship, a silent specter in the sky, before finally running out of fuel and crashing into the merciless, churning waters of the Southern Ocean, thousands of miles from anywhere. The revelation triggered the largest, most expensive, and most technologically advanced search in human history. Ships and aircraft from dozens of countries converged on this remote stretch of water, an area so vast and with conditions so treacherous that it is often called the Roaring Forties. They scanned the surface for debris. Submarines and autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with sonar scoured the ocean floor, a landscape of deep canyons and underwater volcanoes, searching for a single needle in a continent-sized haystack. For the families of the 239 people on board, this period was an exercise in unimaginable torture. They were gathered in a hotel in Beijing, waiting. Every day brought new theories, new hopes, and new, crushing disappointments. They clung to the possibility of a hijacking, of their loved ones being held captive somewhere alive. The announcement that the plane was now believed to be at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, with no survivors, was delivered to them in a sterile, heartbreaking press conference. Their grief, held in suspension for weeks, finally broke in waves of raw, public anguish. The search of the ocean floor continued for nearly 3 years, covering an area of over 120,000 square kilometers. It found nothing. No wreckage, no black boxes, no trace of the plane. Then, in July 2015, 16 months after the disappearance, a piece of the puzzle finally washed ashore. A section of an aircraft's wing, identified as a flaperon, was discovered on the beach of Réunion Island, off the coast of Africa, thousands of miles from the search area. Serial numbers confirmed it belonged to 9M MRO. It was the first, and for a long time the only, physical proof that MH370 had indeed met its end in the Indian Ocean. In the years that followed, more than 20 other pieces of debris, confirmed or believed to be from the aircraft, have washed up on the shores of Mozambique, Tanzania, and Mauritius, carried across the ocean by the powerful currents. These fragments of the plane are ghosts themselves. They confirm the crash, but they tell us nothing about what happened in the cockpit during those 7 silent hours. The theories remain, each one as unproven as the next. Was it a deliberate act of mass murder-suicide by a troubled pilot? Was it a hijacking by an unknown party that went wrong? Or was it a more insidious, silent killer, slow decompression or hypoxia event, perhaps caused by a fire or mechanical failure, which incapacitated everyone on board, leaving the plane to fly on autopilot until its fuel was exhausted? This ghost flight scenario would explain the lack of communication and the long, steady flight path, but it doesn't easily account for the deliberate shutdown of the transponder and the specific, navigated turns made early in the flight. In January 2017, the official, government-led search was formally suspended. The mystery of MH370 was officially relegated to the cold case file, a problem too vast, too expensive to solve. The final report concluded that the cause of the disappearance could not be determined. The vanishing of MH370 is a uniquely modern parable. It is a story about the limits of our knowledge and the fallibility of our technology. In an age where we feel we know everything, it stands as a colossal monument to the unknown. It reminds us that for all our advancements, the world remains a place of deep, dark voids, both in the geography of our planet and in the complexities of the human heart. The plane did not just disappear from radar screens. It disappeared from the lives of hundreds of families, leaving a void that can never be filled. It left behind 239 stories unfinished, 239 futures unlived. The physical plane is lost to the depths, but the true tragedy resides in the perpetual state of not knowing. The families are left without a grave to visit, without a final answer, suspended forever in the moment of that last, casual message. Good night, Malaysian 370. It was a farewell not just to the air traffic controller, but to the entire known world. The thread that binds these stories is not one of crime, but of absence. It is a profound and unsettling silence that follows a sudden departure. A fire that leaves no trace, a lighthouse with its keepers erased, a man running into a forest, a plane that dissolves into the sky. Each case leaves us with a chilling vacancy, a narrative with its final, most crucial pages torn out. We are left only with the questions echoing in the quiet spaces where people used to be. They remind us that for all our certainty, the edges of our maps are still marked by mystery. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. We hope the stories shared here serve not as entertainment, but as a quiet moment of reflection for those who have vanished and for those they left behind, waiting. Sleep well.